Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Conservation in the Classroom, where you get the opportunity to interact with one of our very own conservation experts here at WWF. My name is Kate. I will be the host for today's session. And before we dive in, I want to take a few minutes just to give a shout out to all of our classrooms that we have joining us on camera. If you are actually watching live, but not on camera, you can use the chat function under your screen there to give yourselves a shout out, and we'll mention you after we get through our camera classes here. So once you hear your school's name mentioned, wave your hands, make some noise, let us know that you're there, okay? So let's start with Miss Elias Warren's class, joining us from San Francisco, California. So excited, they froze with their hands up. Okay, awesome. Next up, joining us all the way from Cape Town, South Africa, we have a group from Earth School. Yay. Okay, next we have the HB Whitehorn group from Verona, New Jersey. Woo, okay. Next up, Mr. Smith's class, joining us from Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. Hi. The camera's blocking me. And finally, we have Miss Flaherty's group joining us from Dayton, Nevada. It's okay. If it's delayed, it still counts. You're still good. Okay, so joining us on the chat, we do have a few groups, I believe, watching us right now. Like I said, if you are watching live but are not on camera, please introduce yourself on the chat. The school we have so far is Covedale Elementary School Green Team from Cincinnati, Ohio. Thank you so much for joining us, as well as the North Tahoe Eco Action Club from Tahoe City, California. Again, thanks everyone for joining us. Of course, the reason you guys are all here today is to hear from our presenter, Pete Pearson, who is the Senior Director of Food Lost and Waste here at WWF. Pete works with businesses and schools to better understand the connection between our food choices and wildlife conservation. And today he's going to talk to us about food waste prevention and food recovery and the decisions we can make to help protect our environment. So without further ado, Pete, if you want to take it from here, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with everybody today. Just want to do a double check. My audio is coming through good. Everybody can hear me? All right, fantastic. Okay, I thought it'd be fun to start out the day and talk a little bit about wildlife. Obviously, the World Wildlife Fund, this is one of our primary missions, right? It's to see that we have conservation of nature globally. And some of my favorite animals, one is the zebra. I don't think you get a more distinct animal ever. And when you see a zebra on the plains of Africa, or when you go and see these in the wild, they are stunning. One of my favorite animals ever. Another one, again, the elephant. When you see an elephant in the wild, it is stunning. It is remarkable. And I'm sure many of you, this is probably your favorite animal. Other ones too, if I don't want to open this up for questions right now, but this is a parrot. And I actually had a chance to see one of these in the wild in the Cerrado of Brazil. This was about 3 weeks ago. I got a chance to go to the Cerrado, which is this huge, expansive savanna in Brazil. And to see one of these in the wild was unbelievable. Some others might be of interest, the shark. Believe it or not, when I was in Cape Town, so the folks in Cape Town might know this very well, you can go swim with sharks if you're crazy enough in Cape Town, just off the coast. I did have a chance to go on one of those trips, but unfortunately, we did not see any great whites, so I didn't get to swim with any. Maybe some of you in Cape Town have. Finally, the tiger. Again, one of my favorite animals, really beautiful, really distinct. And unfortunately, we're losing tigers at a really alarming rate all across the world. But I have a question. What is the one thing that all of these animals have in common? and I'll jump right to it. Here it is. All of these animals are impacted by farming. They're impacted by food and agriculture. And this is one thing that a lot of people, students and even adults, don't really know about or understand, is that all wildlife and biodiversity on this planet, the number one thing that's driving biodiversity and threatening extinction of animals is farming and agriculture and our food system. Right now, it's estimated we have almost 1 million species threatened with extinction. And this is not just within 100 years or 200 years. This is within the next couple decades. And again, when we look at why, 70% of that biodiversity loss is due to farming. It's due to food and agriculture. So it makes the topic of today's conversation really important on multiple levels, because one, food is something that we all need, right? Agriculture and the food system is vital to us every single day. Unless you're strange and not a human like me, I have to eat every single day. And so one of the things that agriculture does is it helps to meet the needs of people. And we have to make sure we do meet the needs of people. But here is an alarming statistic. 30 to 40% of the food that we grow, the food that gets transported and moved all around the planet, 30 to 40% of that is estimated to be lost or wasted. Now, when we waste food, we waste everything that goes into creating food. And this includes energy, water, money, and quite often wildlife habitat. So when we throw food away, we waste everything in the process. We waste everything that goes into creating and growing that food. One of the things that I think it's easy to see statistics like that, 30 to 40%, but really, like, how big is that problem? Like, what does that really mean? So follow me for a sec. If we were to grow the food that we wasted, right? If we looked at the footprint, the size of the farm of wasted food in the United States, so we're just talking about the United States right now, the farm to grow the food we waste would be almost the size of California, 3/4 the size of California. This is a farm where we grow food, and this is the estimate of how much food would be wasted. Just to put it in another way, that's enough food to fill 40 tons every 20 seconds in the United States. So the food that we waste fills 40 tons of dump trucks every 20 seconds. And then the other big problem, 76% of it. So the vast majority of the food waste that we generate, we dump into a landfill. Now, this is another huge problem. So not only are we wasting everything that goes into producing food, but we also put it into a landfill where it creates additional carbon emissions, something called methane. And when that methane gets into the atmosphere, it's a greenhouse gas, and it causes more environmental harm. So we need to stop what we're doing. We need to change how we do things. Who am I? A little bit about myself. This is actually a picture of me that a friend of mine took, because I do a lot of studying of waste. I actually spend a lot more time than most normal people in dumpsters. This is a picture that I took where I was actually doing a waste audit of a school, probably not much unlike your own school, where I was analyzing the waste of a particular school. So my job, my professional job, really is to study waste of humans. And in particular, I focus on studying food waste all across the world. I'm really fascinated by the history of waste too. When I remember being a kid, probably 10, 12 years old, and I thought a lot about why humans generate so much waste. Why is it that we create so much waste? And when you look, you can take this back to even really old ancient times. Some of the first known landfills, the first known dumps were created when people started living together in cities. And actually one of the first landfills they said, I've read, actually was in Athens, Greece, right? And what you see happening is when people start living more in cities, they start living together, you have a lot more waste that's generated. And so if you fast forward from ancient Greece into, let's say, New York City or Boston, right? Here's a picture of a really crowded city right at the turn of the 1900s. So think late 1800s, right in the 1900s. Now, I want everybody to imagine this. Imagine before cars and everybody had horses and buggies. Now, horses generate a certain amount of waste, right? And it's poop. It's waste from the horse. Now imagine millions of people and potentially thousands, if not millions of horses all crammed together in a city. Can you imagine what the smell might have been like, or what the waste generated must have been like? So when we look at how we handle waste, a lot of how we do things today, putting it in the landfill or taking it away from the cities, was because they had to do it in the old days, right? It became a sanitary problem. People had a lot of germs. There was a lot of sickness because the waste was all in the cities. And so getting it into landfills and creating landfills was actually something really new, and it was progressive, and they were doing some really great things. But now we live in a time when we generate way too much waste, and we have to think about how to reduce the amount of waste that we have. So what I thought would be kind of fun is to step you through a video that tells the story of waste and recycling today. So everybody can probably, you know, every day, maybe it's your chore, like my kids. My kids' chore is to take the trash out to the curb each day, or to take the composting down. But you can imagine each day, this is in New York City, humans generate a lot of waste. We usually sort things into buckets. And what I wanted to show you was how things work within an industrial recycling process. So this is material waste. This is a facility actually right outside San Francisco. So the classroom in San Francisco, this is where your waste actually goes. It goes to these big, giant places where they accumulate all the materials and all the goods from the waste sorting. And then what happens in these sort facilities is they begin to take these mountains and these huge piles of trash, and then you start to put it through an entire facility that sorts out all your material recycling. Now, this is why it's really important to make sure that you sort your waste and recycling, because if you don't sort it correctly, it causes all kinds of problems in a facility like this. In fact, this little conveyor belt that you see, one of the most important things to try to keep out of the recycling bins is plastic bags. Plastic bags cause all kinds of problems with a facility like this, in a sort facility. You'll see these people, they're pulling out plastic bags as we speak, because they cause so many problems later down the line when they get gunked up into the machine. All right, now here's one of my favorite ones. So all along this conveyor belt, there's different types of mechanisms to sort out the different materials. This one is blowing air up so that it can blow tin cans and aluminum, which is a lighter material, up into a collection part. So you'll see this air, and it's lifting the tin cans and the aluminum cans off into the sort chute, which I think is pretty cool. What happens at the end of this process, after all of this sorting and recycling, what happens is they try to get it into individual types of materials. And then these materials are something that you can actually sell, and you can create revenue from it. You can sell the aluminum, you can sell the paper, you can sell the plastic. They put it into these big bales, and you're able to actually make money on it. So at certain times, you can make money on these mountains of what we think are trash, but it's cash. It's how to turn your trash into cash. And that's what happens on the industrial side. Now, if your school takes food waste and you do something different with food waste, this is typically what happens. You're going to put all your food waste into these big buckets, and it's going to likely go to a compost facility. Now, compost is a way to make use of food waste and to create another valuable material instead of just putting it in landfill. So typically you'll have these big semi-trailers that take all the food waste, and then you're going to dump it into a place like this. I always think of this as a way to create a recipe for compost. So you mix the food waste, which looks pretty gross, in with wood material, a brown material like you see here, this wood. They put it into a big grinding facility, and then they'll grind up that food waste and the wood waste together as a recipe. And then what you'll do is you'll cover it, you'll add oxygen, and you'll let it sit and cook, they call it, right? You create the compost and it sits there for maybe a couple weeks or even a couple months. And then at the end of it, once you have cooked out all the pathogens and all the viruses, you create compost and ultimately something that you can put in your garden and return back to nature. It's a beautiful thing. So what we'll talk about today, and what I'd love to hear from you all on, is what can your school do about food waste? How do you make sure to do your part and to take food waste and do something better with it? So one thing, we've created a program called Be a Food Waste Warrior. This is a way for your school to start auditing and measuring and understanding how much food waste you have, and then also create a way and a conversation about why this matters to wildlife and conservation and why it's so important. The first thing we want to do, so if you leave with anything today, it's that you have to prevent food waste. We want to prevent it from even happening. Reduction and prevention of food waste is the #1 priority. Then we would love to see that any edible food that comes out of your cafeteria, maybe you could create a donation program with your community and you could donate edible food to those in need. And then of course, like you saw in the video, diverting it away from landfill. So landfill is something where we don't want food waste to go. And so for an absolute minimum, let's find ways to divert food waste and to compost it and to do something better with it. We've had a lot of work happening over the last year. Actually, we had 46 different schools all across the country that did 222 audits of their food waste in their cafeteria. And we just put it all together in this big report that we called a Food Waste Warrior report. We're getting ready to release this in a couple weeks, and it talks all about the progress that these schools made in reducing food waste and becoming food waste warriors and champions for this effort. There was, in most of the cities, and this is kind of fun to think about, in most cities, each of the schools was actually visited from the local news. They had videos created, and you could go online and you could see all of these schools' work and what they did, because the local news stations all came and visited and did videos on them. One of the first things you can do to start this is to plan and work with your school and your principal and your teachers to do a food waste audit. This is typically pretty fun for most kids. You get to go out and you get to analyze your trash. You set up a whole sorting and facility in your cafeteria, and you get to do a food waste audit and analyze what's in the trash, and you get to see what you can ultimately do to reduce it. So that's the basics. I would love to hear questions and start a conversation and see what people are thinking. So I will open it up to the group.
Great. Thank you so much, Pete. That was really interesting. I think we all learned a lot from that presentation. So now, classes, is your chance to start getting those questions ready. We did have a few groups join us on the chat that we wanted to just give a quick shout out to before we dive into our questions here. Let's see, we have Senna, who is a part of Miss Elias Warren's class in San Francisco. She's actually at the airport right now watching you, Pete, so that's awesome. And then we also have Miss Nichols' German online class from Illinois. Thank you both for joining us on the chat. And again, make sure to put your questions, if you're watching us and are not on camera, use that chat function to add any questions that you may have for Pete in there. All right, so let's start with Miss Elias Warren's class. You guys are first up for your very first question for Pete. Make sure to get right in front of your camera there and be nice and loud for us.
Have to do something. Okay, so my question is, can all food be composted?
That is a super good question. Can all food be composted? For the most part, it's only for composting. It's typically only for fruits and vegetables. It can be a little complicated when you try to compost, let's say, chicken bones or proteins, animal proteins. You can compost it, but it's not as easy. And typically, most compost facilities only take fruit and vegetables. They don't take animal proteins like meat. So think chicken, pork, beef. They're probably not going to take that in a compost. That's a great question, though.
That was a really good question. Okay, next up, our group from South Africa, Earth School. You guys are up next for your first question for Pete.
My question is, do earthworms come in the progress of composting, and how?
Do earthworms come? Yes, actually, when you create good compost and you put compost into the soil, it creates a really great environment that earthworms love. And earthworms are so good for the soil. Like if you have earthworms in your soil, if you take a shovel and you dig into the soil and you find earthworms, that typically means you have really healthy soil. What earthworms do is they burrow in and they create all these little holes and gaps and places for oxygen and water to infiltrate in the soils. And so if you have compost and earthworms, man, you are doing good. It means you have really, really healthy soil.
Earthworms are those unsung heroes, I guess, huh?
Oh, yeah.
All right, next up, HB Whitehorn.
Okay. Sorry, can somebody go next? They're not in line. Who has a question? Well, did you have a question? Now they're being very shy now, Kate. Somebody else can go.
Okay, we'll come back to you. We'll go on to Mr. Smith's group in Florida. What's your question?
Okay, so my first question would be, if we had to work with our schools, what would be the proper procedure for working with the school if you were to implement your food waste program? And the second question would be, if you were going to start the program in the first place, how would you get it to a food resorting place where they could properly recycle the food or the waste produced by the school?
Yeah, those are two really excellent questions. Okay, so if I was to start this in my school, the first person that I would probably talk to is my school principal. So maybe set up a meeting with your school principal and find a teacher that you have that's really interested in helping you out. The second group that I would talk to is the lunchroom staff. So I would go talk to your lunchroom and your cafeteria cook. And then I would also talk to the lunchroom monitor, the person that is the monitor each day in the cafeteria. So once you start talking to those groups, you get their approval to try a food waste audit, then you're on the right track. One of the things that doing an audit does is it shows you how much food waste you typically generate in a typical cafeteria each day. And so once you start to understand how much food waste you're dealing with each day and each week, then you can start to look at how you divert it away. If you were to keep it on site, let's say you wanted to do a composting operation at your school, what I would do is I would look at a tumbler. I would look at finding one of those big tumblers that keeps everything in one container. You turn it every couple days to keep the oxygen. but then that keeps the rats and the mice and all the things that you don't want in the compost bin away. But then what you can also do is you can talk to your community and find out if you have composting in your community. And then you can see, based on your audits, how much that would cost to send it to a compost bin. And it all starts with the audit. I mean, once you have the audit, you know how much you generate, then you can figure out solutions for what to do with it. It's a really great question.
Okay, perfect. Next up is Miss Flaherty's group.
Isn't that?
Oh, no, go.
Okay. So our first question was, how does methane gas that's produced from wasted food affect the ocean and its ecosystem?
I'm sorry, affect the ocean? Did you say the ocean?
Yeah, and its ecosystem.
Man, that's a tough question. So one, methane gas is I mean, there's a couple different things that I've read, and methane gas is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide alone. So it's anywhere from 25 to 70 times more potent than carbon dioxide. But it doesn't last as long in the atmosphere. Now, there's potential that the ocean can actually absorb carbon dioxide. So the more greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere, the more that can be absorbed into the oceans. But it's a good question. I don't have the perfect answer for it, to be honest with you. It's something that I would have to research a little better. I do know that sometimes the methane that is released from, or that's generated in landfills, sometimes you have capture systems that try to capture that methane and actually use it to create natural gas and to take as much of it out of the landfill as possible. But they're not that efficient at actually capturing all the methane that's released from a landfill. So the best thing to do still is to keep it out of landfills altogether and to not even create the methane from landfills.
Okay, that was a really good question. Let's see, our group from HB Whitehorn, if you guys are ready now, you're back up.
Why did you choose to study waste and not like anything else?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think I've been really obsessed or really committed to researching the food system. And when you look at food, when you look at the things that we have to do to change the food system, one of the seemingly easy things to start with is to not waste as much food. And so I like the fact that it seems simple, but it's really a challenging problem. And I just personally don't like waste at all. I try to reduce waste in all aspects of my life, and it's always been something that I've liked. But particularly, I really like being involved in trying to fix our food system, trying to figure out how 7 billion or 9 billion people are going to eat on this planet, and to do it while we still have nature on the planet as well. I love that challenge, and I want to see us solve that problem. Thanks for that question.
I knew that question was going to come up, Pete, as to why you enjoy dumpster diving.
Yeah,
You were bound to be asked it.
It doesn't hurt too that I'm not grossed out by it. I will jump in a dumpster. I will pick up trash anywhere because I don't think it's gross. So
there you go.
I'm just weird.
We're going to take a couple questions actually that have been submitted in the chat now, and then start back up with the same cycle of classes. So classes on camera, you can go ahead and get your second question ready for Pete while we take a couple of the questions from the chat. So the North Tahoe Eco Action Club has quite a few questions. We'll pick one for now for you, Pete. Is the wasted food remnants of food, or is it actual whole pieces of food?
Is wasted food remnants of food or whole pieces?
Or whole food, yeah.
I guess it depends on where it's coming from. In schools, I've seen a lot of just whole pieces of food that aren't even touched or even opened, thrown in the trash. And so I'll bet if everybody goes to lunch next week and you start looking in the trash, you're going to see unopened milk containers. You're going to see whole apples, whole bananas, whole pieces of fruit, whole pieces of food that have not even been touched go right into the trash. And you have to scratch your head and wonder, okay, is this the right thing to be doing? Probably not. A lot of times, though, you have to look at food that has been eaten or plate waste that maybe you didn't finish your whole lunch. And a lot of that goes into the waste stream too. And so it's totally what we call inedible food waste you see a lot of in the waste stream. So you'll see both.
Okay. The Covedale School wants to know, what can we do with food waste if we don't have composting?
If you don't have composting on site. Well, there's one option that I've tried. One is called bokashi composting, where you actually take the food waste and you ferment it. It's a little more complicated, and I probably wouldn't recommend it, but it's fun as a science experiment if you wanted to try it. You actually take the food waste, you put it into a sealed barrel, and it's almost, you ferment it, like you break it down in a oxygen-free environment, and it creates a compost tea, and it creates a really nice soil amendment once you're done. But again, it's a little tricky. It's called bokashi composting.
Okay, so let's do another round from our classes that are on camera. So we'll go in the same order that we went last time. We'll start back up with Miss Elias Warren's group. What's your next question for Pete?
Okay, so do you think it is possible? Do you think it is possible, because humans have adapted to wasting food over the centuries? Do you think it is possible to persuade them not to waste food?
This is the golden question I have to think about every single day. Do I think people will stop wasting food, right? Do you think it's possible to get 7 billion people to not waste food? Oh my gosh. I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say I think it is possible to get humans to think and to not waste food. Do we get every single person, 7 billion, 9 billion people? Probably not. But I would say that we get a good 80 to 90% of humans to say that it is possible to not waste food. Good question.
There's that optimism. I love it. Okay, Earth School, you guys are up next.
Is there a limit to how much fruit and vegetables you add to your compost? We have 2 questions this one. And
Is there a limit to how many fruits and vegetables you can compost? There is no limit. You can compost them all. Some of them take a little longer to compost. Like if you try to compost a corn cob or an avocado peel, it's going to take longer to break down, but sooner or later it's going to be composted. What's the second question?
how do you get the word out and let other people how do you get the word out and let other people know that they're wasting food?
Well, I think it starts a lot with schools like you guys. So you should take responsibility for your own school to start with, right? So it's really hard to get the word out unless you're trying to do your part in your own school. So I would start with your school first. And then once you have a really great story, call the news station, right? Call your local newspaper and tell them about all the great work you're doing. And then one, you get to be on the news, maybe. You get to be talked about. And then maybe somebody else in another school in another town sees that and sees your success, and they do the same thing. So I would say do it in your school first.
Great questions. Okay, let's jump to Mr. Smith's class, Palm Beach Gardens. What's your next question?
Who has it?
Oh, yeah. Is it getting better? Like, well, is it getting better or is it getting worse? Like food waste.
Is food waste getting better or getting worse?
Yeah.
I mean, oh man. Well, this is where I have to say it's probably not getting better right now. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think we're wasting less food. I don't think the trend line. So if we look at how things are going, it's probably staying about the same. We're still wasting. We need to set the trend line down. We need to start seeing food waste go down, and we need to create less of it. So that's not happening yet, but I'm hopeful we'll see that soon.
Okay, next up is Miss Flaherty's class.
So I have two questions, one from him and one from me.
Okay.
How can a school find the money to start up a compost?
Got it. So if you're in the US, a lot of times there's grants you can look to apply for, local grants. I've seen these through either the farm to school program or so I would do a search and check out if there's local grants available. The other place that I would go, actually, I would talk to your PTA or your parent teacher associations or organizations. A lot of time the PTA or the PTOs, believe it or not, they have a pretty good bit of money, and they typically love to spend it on things like this. So that'd be my first place to go, actually, is your PTO organization. What's the second question?
So how many landfills are close to rivers or just near any bodies of water? And is it bad if it's near a body of water?
Ooh, I don't know how many landfills are close to bodies of water. I mean, I've seen a lot of them that are. In the United States, landfills are pretty heavily regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. And so they have to have a lining that protects them from any leakage or seepage of even groundwater and surface water that goes into rivers. So you do have environmental protections that make sure that you don't see that, but nothing's ever 100%. So I'm sure in some cases, in some parts of the country, they've had problems with leakage into rivers and into water systems. But I don't know the exact number, sorry.
I was gonna say, that's a really tough question. Okay, our group from HB Whitehorn, if you guys are ready for your next question for Pete.
Okay, so how much success have other schools had with sharing tables?
With share tables, a ton of success. So we have been working with, I mentioned 46 different schools all across the country. And what we found is just the schools doing audits and setting up share tables and reorganizing their cafeteria to try to prevent food waste. A lot of them reduced food waste just within a couple weeks, maybe 4 to 6 weeks. And some of them reduced food waste by 30, 40, one of them was even close to 50%. A lot of food that they was always going in the trash, they were able to prevent it and reduce it just by doing regular audits and making it a priority for the school. And the share tables, that is a great idea. We need to have more schools doing share tables because it's a really easy way to make sure that the unopened milk or the uneaten food doesn't go in the trash.
Okay, we are going to take probably 2 more from the chat, and then our groups that are on camera, we may have just a few minutes left for a very, very quick speed round. So if you want to start brainstorming a quick question for Pete that we can kind of run through very quickly. The one from the chat, let's see, we have a question from GVES that wants to know, how can you reduce the waste of meat and food at a school?
How can you say the last part, reduce the waste of meat and? I think you're on mute.
I'm sorry. It says, how can you reduce the waste of meat and food at a school?
That's a great question. Reducing the waste of meat. Well, one, I think you would have to start working with your school chef or your school cook, because I'm sure there's a certain number of students that maybe you're vegetarian, don't prefer meat. And so one of the ways is to have vegetarian options so that there is something else that you could be served and you don't have to take the animal meat or the protein. you can take a vegetarian option. And that could be one way to reduce your meat waste, by not serving people meat when they don't want to eat it. So that's one way.
Okay, perfect. Next question from the chat here is, let's see, why don't companies make more recyclable packaging?
Well, I think a lot of companies are really trying hard to make recyclable packaging. One of the things that makes it difficult is every community recycles different things. So not all communities can take certain types of materials into their recycling facilities, like I showed you the video and the pictures of. That makes it really difficult for companies who, let's say a company sells a certain type of product, but they sell it all across the country. If every single community recycles different things, it makes it really difficult for that one company to make sure that it can be recycled everywhere. But I can say that there is a lot of work being done, and we're really trying to a lot of companies want to see that work everywhere.
Okay, so we're gonna jump back to do our speed round with our classrooms that are on camera. So this is gonna be a very quick round because we do want to be conscious of people's time. So Miss Elias Warren's class, your last question for Pete.
I have 4 quick questions. Okay, so my first one is very easy. It's how long have you been doing this job?
I've been a waste warrior, I'd say, for about 10 years. Since 2009.
That was a perfect quick question. Next up, our group from South Africa, the Earth School.
Of the 46 schools that you went to, did any of them actually have their own compost and vegetable gardens?
Yes. Yes, actually, quite a few do. A lot of schools now that I see do have vegetable gardens and composting. You know what the number one problem is, though? It's to keep it going every single year, right? There's a lot of energy and a lot of excitement to get things started, but the real hard part is to keep that vegetable garden and to keep the composting going every single year. So my advice, make it a chore for a certain grade. Maybe the top grade in an elementary school is 5th or 6th grade. Make it something so that the 5th or 6th graders have to do that chore every single year in order to keep the compost bin going. Or if you're a middle school, maybe it's the 8th graders or the 9th graders. It's their job and their responsibility to keep the program going. That way you can make sure that it doesn't stop.
Okay, good question. Mr. Smith's class, your last question for Pete.
Is there any way to reverse the effects we've had on animals?
In what way? Reverse the effects? I mean, on biodiversity loss?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think one of the ways to reverse the effects, or to at least stop them, is to, we have this tagline here where we let's freeze the footprint of food. So let's look at our agricultural system and let's not expand it anymore, right? Let's not cut down any more forests. Let's not till up any more grasslands. Let's not lose any more savannas. And so if we provide places for animals to keep a home by not expanding agriculture's footprint, that's one way we can stop and maybe even reduce the biodiversity loss on the planet. Great question.
Okay, next up, Miss Flaherty's class.
So our question is, what degree did you get from your university? And did you change your pathways before becoming a food warrior?
Yeah, great question. I did. So when I graduated from college, I actually got a degree in information systems, technology, computers. And then I started to work at a grocery chain in the United States. And I decided to go back and get an MBA in sustainable business. So it was one of the first MBA programs, a Master's of Business Administration. It was one of the first programs in the country that focused in on green and sustainable business. And so I did that program for 2 years, and it really changed the way I thought about everything and took me on a whole different course in my career. So what I would say in terms of advice, it is really an amazing thing to go back to school and to continue your education path, because it can completely change everything in your life and your whole career, which it did for me.
Okay, and last but not least, our group from HB Whitehorn, your last question.
All right, do you think that if we can get at least one country's worth of people to participate in composting, it will make an impact?
I absolutely think that if we got the United States to do this type of work, if we took that number of 76% of all the food waste going to landfill and we got that to 0, and we composted everything, and we reduced our waste in the United States, it would absolutely make an impact on the entire world. I just read an article yesterday that the United States basically uses so many of the world's resources, and it's more than any country per capita, meaning per person, we create so much waste in the United States, more than any other country in the world. And so if we did our part and we changed things in the United States, it would have a huge effect on the entire planet.
Well, Pete, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. And again, I think we learned a lot from this presentation. All of you that are watching on camera or off, if you still have questions for Pete that didn't get answered today, you can have your teacher email them to wildclassroom@wwfus.org, and we'd be happy to pass those questions along to him. We are out of time, but before we go, we want to unmute everyone's microphone so everyone can give a big thank you and goodbye to Pete. So go ahead, everyone.